Hello and welcome back to Venshon Denshon, my YouTube channel. And it is an immense pleasure. And this is going to be our first one stepping outside of the trumpet, but still staying with someone who's incredibly influential and someone I consider one of my teachers. We have Mick Mulcahy, as he's known in Australia, or Mick, as he's known in the States. And Mike, I'm going to keep calling you Mike because that's what I grew up with. I'm going to start, first of all, by welcoming you, but I'm going to throw a question that I'm throwing to my guests. You've had an immense career as a trombonist, educator, conductor, musician. I know of you playing in the Melbourne Symphony, the Westdeutscher Rundfunk. You came back to Australia, taught and bred the generation of trombone players of my age. Then you got the job in Chicago Symphony, teaching at Northwestern. What if someone asked you, which is me asking you now, a few of the really, really memorable concerts of your career and why? Where you were playing. Let's start with ones you were playing.
Yeah, okay. I wish I could remember, well, I can remember the first time I played with an orchestra, and it was with the Willoughby Symphony in Sydney. And I played a very exotic piece called Marsh Love of Tchaikovsky. And it seemed to have 15 flats in it. And I was very excited because it was the first time that I was not playing in a brass band. And so I was surrounded by strings and woodwinds. And we were playing in the Willoughby Town Hall, which has since been demolished. But at that time, it was brand new and kind of state of the art for 1970, whatever it was. So that was very memorable. And I have to tell you about another time, and this is a little bit more personal, because as a high school kid, my uncle, John Lehman, ran the Rockdale Light Opera Company, and he hired me to play in a production of South Pacific. And that was my first paid gig. I think I got $5 a night. And it was very exciting because it was in the theater. And it's the first time I got to wear a tux. So they are memorable. Now, I can't remember my first concert in Tassie. I wish I could, because that was my first professional gig. And that I was only there for half a year. I thought I'd be there for a lifetime because trombone jobs are so scarce. And I still love Tasmania, still love the Tasmanian Symphony. It's one of Australia's best orchestras. It's a small orchestra, but it punches way above its weight. Then I still have land in Tasmania. So we have some kind of fantasy about somehow spending some life down there. And we get down there every chance we can, which is infrequent, unfortunately. I have to say my first concert with the Chicago Symphony was also really memorable, hard to beat, because I started my career with that orchestra in London. They were at the beginning of a European tour. And before I moved to Chicago, I was hired to go on a 4-week tour of Europe and Scandinavia with Sir Georg Scholti.
Mahler 5, right?
No.
Oh, wrong.
No. So this is the Proms in 1989. And the CSO traveled with the choir as well. We had a performance of the Damnation of Faust, complete in London and in Salzburg. And the choir came over for 2 concerts. It cost $1 million for 2 concerts to get the choir there.
Wow.
It was a very memorable concert because, firstly, this particular piece of Berlioz is high art, and it's an odd piece. It's kind of a music drama, unstaged, with chorus and soloists. It's quite difficult. It's long. It's opera length, 2.5 hours or something. That's a wild guess. But the singers were incredible. The lyric tenor from New Zealand, Keith Lewis, sang. Jose von Damme, wonderful baritone. And the wonderful mezzo from Sweden, Annie Sofa Otto was the mezzo soprano. And the singing was just stunning. And Scholti had the orchestra on a very tight rein. It was kind of his last chapter with the orchestra, really. And of course, him bringing the Chicago Symphony to London, which was his longtime home, was his chance to show off. So he was a very disciplined person anyway, but it was a very electric performance, absolutely electric. I mean, for me personally, because it was my first time I played in public with the orchestra. And so I'm sitting with legends, people like Dale Clevenger and Adolf Herseth and people of this ilk. And the performance level was very high. And actually, it's demonstrable because they recorded that concert. It was live broadcast on the BBC, and it was live videoed, live for television as well. So that's since been released as a, whatever you do with videos and DVDs these days. That's a commercial product of my very first concert, which is very, very, very fun. It's also memorable because the trombone section decided to walk to the concert across Hyde Park. We were staying in Mayfair, and it was a beautiful late August night, and it seemed like a great idea at the time. And we didn't think how far could it possibly be from Mayfair to the Royal Albert Hall. Well, it turned out that it was quite a long way. And we were walking for like 20 minutes and there's no sign of the hall. And I was so nervous. I had to run. I just could not. I didn't have the nerve just to trust that we'd get there. I ran. I sprinted to the hall, and it took probably 10 minutes to get there. By the time I got there, the dressing room where our tails were stored was locked. I had to go upstairs onto the concert level. I had to find a security guy, Captain Yates, wonderful security guy, and he had to come downstairs and unlock it for me. But who should I run into in my panic than Sir George Sholty right there? And he's seeing me. It's like 5 minutes before the concert. And he looked at me and said, "I must say, my dear, you're very relaxed for your first concert." And when I went on stage, I was the first member of the trombone section on stage, and Bud Herseth was not impressed. Yeah, he was. I put him in a grumpy mood, and the other guys just came in casually, easy as, they were old hands. But for me, it was like a potentially career-blowing moment.
Wow. I can see why that's memorable. And it's interesting to me that when I ask you these questions, because for me, growing up as a musician in Sydney in the 80s, I think it was Charles McInnes was the first person who told me about you when he moved to Sydney. There was you and there was Hector, these two kind of, for us, mythical brass players that, and the Bertini Mahler 3 had somehow, there were CDs. And so the Bertini Mahler 3 had filtered down to us. And it's, when you tell that story, it reminds me, like, you're always, I don't know how to express it, that it was not about, the trombone, I played this piece on the trombone. It was never about that with you. It's never been that. And that was something that impressed me immensely. And I'm going to tell you if I think of a memorable concert, and I remember playing Pulcinella with the Australian Chamber Orchestra. Do you remember that?
Sure.
You do? I always wondered whether you would remember that. And so the first two concerts we did in Sydney, and Tim Dowling played trombone and Hector McDonald was playing horn, this other completely legendary figure in Australian brass playing. And we got to Canberra, and I was sitting there playing Pulcinella with you and Hector. And I wonder whether in some way I felt a little bit the same as you might have felt when you landed in Chicago playing with people, playing with Bud Herseth. It's something growing up as a brass player, it's inescapable. Dale Clevenger, Bud Herseth, Arnold Jacobs, they're really inescapable. And then there you were playing with them. So
yeah,
I think for me, I guess that was a similar moment for me, drawing that parallel. And what I remember was just amazing, like playing this trumpet part and in the end, and just It was just sat, and it was, yeah, I still remember that as an incredible memory for me.
Well, they are great moments, and you realize on the one hand that something special is happening. On the other hand, you realize that everyone is everyone cooks with gas, or everyone cooks with water. There's a saying in German about the fact that everyone has to boil water to cook. Or do you remember that saying?
I think jeder kocht mit Wasser, sagt man, oder?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Anyway, you realize, they have to perform too. They have to warm up too. And you realize they're human as well, but you glean so much about their professionalism and their discipline, but also their vision for playing. And you mentioned that you got the impression from me that playing the trombone was not such an instrumental focus of mine, but the trombone happened to be how I was a musician. I'm paraphrasing you now.
That's exactly what I meant.
Right. And so that's both Dale and Bud were great examples of that. They were extraordinary on their instrument, but it wasn't what they could do on the instrument. It's what they said with their instrument that was memorable. And so for me, that's always been the preoccupation. And it's not because I consider myself to be a great philosopher and a superior or a superior way of thinking about being a musician. I just had the dumb luck of being born into a family of musicians. My mother was a violinist as a young girl and as a young woman, and then later in life studied singing. And my dad studied the trombone, and that's how they met at the Conservatorium in Sydney. And because of their great love of music, our house was literally completely pervaded by music around the clock. I've told this story many times, that the only entertainment in our house was the ABC News, and what in America we call public radio or public TV, NPR, PBS, and or like the BBC, if you like, and classical music. That was it. In all my neighbors' houses, they were watching American sitcoms and cartoons and all kinds of fun stuff. And as a kid, I was jealous that I didn't get to see all the crap that all the other kids were enjoying. On the other hand, passively, all of this music must have been soaking into me, because I understood music before I even touched a trombone. When I say I understood music on a deep level, it sank into me somehow. And then by the time I got interested in playing the trombone, which actually came from my school band at Holy Cross College, the brass band, that's something that I chose to do at that point. At Holy Cross College, which is a Patrician Brothers school, the one I went to is in Ryde, and they're very famous for breeding rugby league players. That's their specialty. And I went to school with a bunch of kids who all became professionals, and it was every kid's dream at Holy Cross to follow in the footsteps of all the kids who became professional footballers. It became pretty obvious to me at about 13 or so that I was not going to be better than average. And it wasn't a conscious decision, but I saw my brother, Anthony, who's a trumpet player. He played in the band at that point, and I followed him into the band, got into the trombone through the band, and then kind of put that trombone together with the music from home. And then I began to take notice, and my dad helped me.
Was he already playing? Was your dad already playing trombone then? I know that your dad's he was a notoriously famous G bass trombone player. Was he already playing then, or did he start after you?
No, you mean playing the instrument?
Yeah.
Well, that's a great story, because my dad picked up the trombone as a young man, and he had the best reason for picking up the trombone. He listened to the radio, and he heard Jack Teagarden playing the trombone, and he thought, I got to play the trombone. And so he literally went to a store, he bought a trombone, and then he enrolled in the conservatorium and took trombone lessons. on the basis of Jack Teagarden. And when he was at the Conservatorium, he fell in love with classical music. He spent no time playing jazz, and he became an absolutely passionate music consumer as well as a passionate trombone player. So that, you know, that was, gosh, I've never figured out which years they were. They were 50s or something. Hold it. Late 40s, 50s. I need to find out years on that. I haven't figured that out. No, but he played the trombone for a long time, and so I don't know how he ended up on bass trombone. That I'd never figured out. But yeah, he was a big fan of the G, which was a complete anachronism by the time I was I took up the trombone. But there wasn't much music that he didn't know, and he also had the scores for everything. So I grew up in a house full of scores. And he never listened to music without a score. And when they would play the broadcast from Bayreuth, he would stay up late into the night in listening with great zeal and passion and making all kinds of gestures. And many, many, many years later, now long into my Chicago Symphony time, on a tour of Berlin with Barenboim, our then music director. This is classic Barenboim. We had 3 concerts at the Berliner Festtage, I think it was, and around every CSO concert was a ring opera. So there was a Rheingold one night in the CSO, and this was at the Staatsoper. Our orchestra was not involved in the rings. It was the Berliner Staatsoper, Rheingold CSO, Walküre CSO, Siegfried CSO, and then Götterdämmerung. And Barenboim was thoughtful enough to invite Gene Pokorny, our tuba player, and myself on bass trumpet to sit in and play the ring with him. Wow. So that was a once in a lifetime experience. And my parents were on tour with me, and Barenboim was kind enough to give them his box for the whole cycle. My dad, being a great music fan, he went up and visited them, and my dad started raving to Barenboim about Wagner and this and that. And my dad is actually very well read and very, very knowledgeable. And my dad mentioned a book, an introduction to the ring, that was written by an American Jew, Bernstein. I don't remember his first name, but a kind of a user's guide to the ring. And Dad was saying how great it was that he was able to see the ring through this particular person's eyes, this Germanic music through this particular music historian's eyes. And Barenboim never forgot that story.
Wow. I actually met your dad a couple of times. I don't think you were there. He came to maybe a quintet concert I played with Paul and the guys. And I remember about your dad is just the effervescence of the man, the enthusiasm, the excitement. So when I hear you talking about that, getting a bit more insight into his passion for music, I could imagine that being there in the box seat, literally watching you, seeing you play bass trumpet in the ring, there must have been a pretty special moment, or not a moment, that's longer than a moment, a Wagner opera. It's pretty special for him. He must have loved that. Yeah,
my life has been very blessed with very serendipitous intersections, unimaginable, and just so very fortunate. I look at most of it in disbelief, to be honest with you.
I actually know what you mean, and in my own way, I look back on things like, was that really me? Is it conceivable that things like that could happen? And yeah, I mean, the evidence, I mean, for you, there's video evidence, and there's sound evidence of all of these events. I would wonder whether we could pivot a little bit to Cologne when you're in the Westdeutsche Rundfunk before, because I remember that Mahler series with Bertini. I only ever heard Mahler 3. I don't even know whether it was a complete cycle. But can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Well, I preceded Gary Bertini in Cologne, and I was very fortunate to get that opportunity. Germany is so blessed with classical music, so blessed with opera houses and music culture. And as a young Australian, I was my original dream, and this is kind of through my father, because my father loved London orchestras, and he had a particular affection for the London Philharmonic. So, and he also loved Beecham. So I kind of grew up with a lot of Beecham, a lot of London orchestras. And so my kind of dream in my mind was to go to London to work. But London was never a realistic possibility. I never had a realistic way of ever working there, even if I was good enough. And so that dream went unrequited. But Hector McDonald was a big inspiration, and so was Andrew Joy, two Australian horn players who had big careers in Germany. And I became very aware of this, mythical Das Orchester magazine that was just littered with orchestral culture and hundreds of orchestras advertising for musicians. And so after a pretty good start to my life in music, as you said, in Tasmania, and then in the Melbourne Symphony, I wanted to spread my wings. I had the thirst to try to be in a world-class orchestra, and so it's a long story, but ended up in Germany at a relatively young age of 23, and trying to get auditions, which was difficult because I wasn't known. I didn't study there, but I did hear on the grapevine about orchestras that were looking for trombonists, and Andrew Joy was kind enough to share the fact that they'd been looking for a first trombone for a long time. So I think they'd had maybe 4 auditions for Germans by the time I auditioned. And the day I auditioned, I did not have an invitation. I was a man on the street. But Andrew said that this audition is happening, and if we don't find anyone, you should be available. So I was literally an unemployed, unauthorized tourist in Germany, who happened to have a trombone, who happened to be on the scene of an audition at a time when they didn't, again, find someone. And Andrew Joy had the courage and kindness to speak up on my behalf, and the orchestra voted to hear me. And so I went in. I got into the Funkhaus there in Cologne, and I went in and I played my audition. And the result of that audition was that there would be another audition because I was uninvited and other people didn't have the chance to compete. So a month later, they held another audition, this one the first for international. So Germans were allowed to apply, and people from outside Germany as well. So there was an international audition, and on my second shot, I won that job with the orchestra, and I'll never forget the sound of a German orchestra sitting in that and hearing the first resonance of an orchestra, and particularly in the strings and in the lower strings and the double basses, just having that tremendous resonant basis for an orchestra, and complete absence of force and a richness in the string sound was revelatory. And I had a very, very happy 7 years there, and I could easily have spent the rest of my life there. We left Germany for personal reasons, more to do with the fact that we made a call way back then, and I don't know, still to this day, I don't know if it was really that justified, but we thought that the lifestyle of children, young children growing up in Australia was so special that having just started a very young family, we decided to move back. And that's how I ended up going to Canberra and to teach. Every time I get a job, I think it's forever. And I thought that one was forever too. In any case, they were great days in Cologne. Eventually, Bertini succeeded the music director. It was a Japanese maestro at that time. His name was Hiroshi Wagasugi. He was a very, very musical person. very different to the very kind of flashy technical people like Iwaki, who we knew well in Australia, or Ozawa, who's very famous internationally. He was not that kind of, he was a more kind of a sensitive type. I think the orchestra was a little bit muscular towards him, I would say, if I was going to be diplomatic about it. But I was there towards the end of his time, so maybe that relationship was getting a little bit old, as they do. But wonderful experience to be in a German orchestra, to experience the German trumpet properly, because that was exclusively Deutsche Trompete in that orchestra. And there's a couple of famous trumpet players, a very famous older gentleman, Helmut Schneiderwind, was one of our first trumpets, who was kind of a mini Tuffy, Herseth kind of personality. He was an old pro. He'd been through his battles and very, very kind of old school. And then there was Manfred Rotzoll. He came from a trumpet playing family in Berlin. I think his dad was in the Berlin Phil. One of his other brothers played in the radio in Berlin, and he was a very, very, very tasty trumpet player. Very nice experiences, and incredible musicians throughout the orchestra. Some of my favorites were Zinkowski, the violinist, who later went to the Vienna Phil as concertmeister, and also maybe my all-time favorite musician there was Rainer Segers, who was the long-time timpanist of the Berlin Phil. We left at the same time, and he went to Berlin.
Amazing. Really one of the truly exceptional timpanists that I've heard, and absolutely amazing. Unbelievable, really.
He affected an orchestra like Herseth affected an orchestra. It was 100%. Just like, but very few people like that. Yeah, definitely. I'm just thinking back to hearing him and one time playing with him, that when you're with a timpani player, when it's really working, it makes everything so much easier, especially on the trumpet part, when you've got all of those unison playing Haydn symphonies, Brahms symphonies. With a timpani player, it's like you get everything for free. It's a physical, it's a visceral physical feeling. Wow, I didn't realize he was in Köln before. That's amazing. Yeah, we had 7 years. We had 7 years together, and on my last concert, which was a concert of the complete Slavonic dances of Dvorak, both opuses. I had a friend from New Zealand, David Tane, a young trombonist, staying with me, and he drove me to the concert, and I asked him to take photos, and I got a lot of photos during the concert with capturing my last concert with Rainer in many of the pictures as well. So that's a treasure for me. One thing I will say, and this is an important observation about German orchestras, and it's something that was later confirmed to me by Barenboim, and that was a sense that in the central repertoire of our art in the Germanic music of continent, there seemed to be something very deeply embedded in the musicians, that they spoke this language more easily than most of us that didn't grow up with it. And Barenboim would mention the same thing to me. He would say that he conducts in many places where, in some cases, the technical level of execution was higher, but the understanding of the music was more shallow. And he said, in some ways, the orchestras he conducted, who were so accomplished, would do anything he asked, and were willing to do anything he asked, but didn't always understand why he asked. And he said in some German orchestras, he wouldn't even have to ask, because it was such a natural thing for them to play in the way that they do. And obviously, the Berlin Philharmonic is a great example of that, and maybe the Vienna Philharmonic, even more individual in their understanding of classical music. Their traditions run very deep.
Definitely. No, there's no doubt. There's no doubt. And what you said about the string sound as well, when we're playing in Zurich, I also noticed that there were quite a few German violinists and bass players, and it's a richness of sound. And I wonder where that comes from, though. Does it come from the language, the culture, the history? Maybe it's a combination of everything. But I've also noticed that, I think.
I think it's I think it's something that people grow up with, but I think there's also a practical reason, and I think part of it is the fact that some of the European halls are not as large and they're often more resonant. So you're talking about Zurich and the Tonhalle Hall, which is a very, very beautiful hall to play in. I've never played in it, but I've gone to concerts there. And so
one nervous trumpet player remembers you going to a concert there. I remember I think we were playing some Nielsen Symphony or something. Oh my God, Mike's there in the audience. Anyway, that's another story.
Well, I was not disappointed, so you shouldn't have a bad feeling about that. But one thing I do notice is that I think that the halls are generally of a higher level in Europe. We do have a couple of really great halls. I love Carnegie Hall in New York. I love Symphony Hall in Boston. I've never played in Severance Hall, but Severance Hall in Cleveland also has a very fine reputation. The other halls tend to be rather too dry or rather too large. And so I think sometimes the orchestras are forced to make more sound than they should, or maybe they fall into the trap of overplaying to make up for the fact that the hall is not doing its part. But if you think of, the Concertgebouw, if you think of the Musikverein, if you think of the Tonhalle, and then there's a beautiful hall in Wuppertal. I remember doing Bruckner in Wuppertal with Günther Wann, fantastic sound. I wish I could remember the name of that hall. And then the old hall in Hamburg was a beauty too. The new one's very good for a modern hall, but there was an old hall there that we played on my first CSO tour. That was a superb hall. So just these, I don't know, there were probably less than 2,000 people. They were not very large, and they all had a very warm, resonant sound. And so I think as string players, they never felt that they had to press. Maybe, I'm speaking as an amateur observer here, of course.
Yeah, and it could also be something that I've thought, the difficulty you had getting an invitation in Germany meant that the people that were getting the jobs were the people that had been trained by the people that were in the tradition. And that, I think, also leads to some kind of a lineage of sound and of concept. I think
for sure. And you have to respect the fact that they have a heritage, and that heritage needs to be respected, and that heritage needs to be nurtured and sustained too. Because we want the Czech Philharmonic to sound like the Czech Philharmonic, and we want the Wiener Philharmoniker to sound like the Wiener Philharmoniker.
And speaking of heritage, I want to move now to when you came to Canberra, because in a way, you created something there that's still going in Australia, because you trained a whole bunch of trombone players, and some of the finest trombone players of my generation were studying with you in Canberra. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it was like teaching, because it became a bit of a magnet when you and Hector were there, the trombone players and the horn players, and also the trumpet players going to Paul, but the trombone players and the horn players, they congregated in Canberra. What was
I
that?
was very lucky. I was very lucky that that happened very quickly, and I had done some teaching in Melbourne, and I have to mention the fact that early on in my days in Melbourne, I taught at the Victorian College of the Arts, and one of my memorable students there was Tim Dowling, who's the first trombone in the residency orchestra in the Hague, Den Haag in Holland. And he was my first professional student in the sense that he was almost my age. And I like to make the joke that I only had to be one day better than him to be his teacher. I was certainly more than one day older than him, but we were very close in age. So he was my first professional success. But then in Canberra, a whole bunch of very, very talented people were there, and I started something. There were a couple of really talented students who were already at the school, and I didn't have much impact on them. They were kind of stars, and they had some swagger about them, and I don't think I had any impact on them. And so I don't even really consider that we had much of a relationship. But the new people that came there to study with me, and I can think of several of them. I can think of Tom Burge. I can think of Donna Parkes. Yep. Donna Parkes, Nick Byrne, Chris Harris. Wasn't that long. His family emigrated from South Africa. I remember he came in an audition, and he was young and a little bit on the raw side, but I sensed that he had something pretty special there, and he proved that he did. And then at some point I went to Brisbane to do some teaching, and Scott Kinmont was a student up there, and I have to say I kind of recruited him. I said, you're doing a fine job there, but I think you can do an even finer job if you study with me, which sounds very arrogant, but I don't think he regrets it, and he's been a very successful. So yeah, that was, and here's the deal. I sound like Joe Biden. Here's the deal. If you have certain things that you believe in, certain principles that transcend me, that transcend the way that I play the trombone. If you are able to share your passion and conviction, your sincerity for those musical and aesthetic ideas, I think that you can light a fire in the belly of someone's artistic aspiration. And when you can do that in a situation where there's a few people catching fire at the same time, then you have this kind of there's a word for that in energy when things.
Well, it's a synergy, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's a synergistic confluence of energy that then has an energy of its own. And while you are guiding, if you like, and while you're mentoring, there's a lot of there's a lot of pennies dropping. There's a lot of epiphanies is the word I'm looking for. There's a lot of epiphanies that happen that are not just directly from you. It's not a question. It's not a dogmatic thing of I do this, you do this. I play this short, you play this short. It's never that. My teaching is always about the idea and the rationale, and there are as many questions as answers. When I'm teaching, I ask a lot of questions. I get a lot of thinking going on, and I try to get some deductive process happening in each of their minds, and some kind of prioritization of what are we trying to do in the big picture, and therefore what is our action? How does that dictate how we're going to spend our life now, right today, this next month, this next year, to serve what end? And so I feel like in Canberra, I got to do that for the first time. That's the first time when I had that synergy of young talent, and I had the buy-in on these principles that I believed in very strongly. And then I got the chance to do it again in Chicago. After 10 years there, I had the opportunity to join the faculty at Northwestern, and I started there. And once again, there are some students who were already there, most of whom, the students that I didn't choose, most of them were, some of them were very talented. But as I recruited over those first few years, then another fire took off. I did have some exceptional stars. I had a beautiful trombonist, Philip Nutzman, who was way too smart to become a trombone player full time. He was good enough to, but he became a scientist. He ended up working for NASA. He was an astrophysicist or something like that eventually. Northwestern is a very strong school academically, so you get a lot of great academic talent there as well as musical talent. And then Toby Oft, the first tromboner of the Boston Symphony, came to do his master's at Northwestern, and I knew him the year before Northwestern. I taught for Indiana University, and he was finishing up there, and I was lucky enough that he came to Northwestern after he graduated at IU. So he was in my very, very first year, but there were 2 or 3 stars at the beginning at Northwestern, but it really took, some years to establish the culture, establish the tradition, and now the class atmosphere I've been there for 20 odd years, a little bit more. I would say the class tradition, that energy of that family, the studio family, has been strong for 15 years. And talent's come in and talent's gone out, but the heritage of what we have has remained strong. And I sometimes I'm really sad when a very special student graduates and you think, gosh, will I ever get someone that special again? And you do, you get a range of people, but you find that if the ideas are strong enough and if the culture is strong enough among the students, that they grow together and they gift that energy and they gift those philosophies to the newcomers. They come into the studio and they see this certain way of living, this certain way of acting, this certain care and care about the music as well as care for each other. I'm very happy on a human level with how the class there is to each other. It's very much a family. One person succeeds, we all succeed. It's not a competitive thing, and it's not a hierarchical thing.
That's exactly how it felt to me in Canberra. And I want to keep going with the States, but I just want a couple of things. The first thing is a huge shout out to Tim Dowling and to all of your trombone class in Canberra, dear friends of mine. That I think that is how a tradition is made, because then all of them teach as well, and they pass that on and they add their own thing to it. But I wanted to say also the way you were describing your teaching, I can attest that that's true, because I think I only ever took 2 lessons from you, formal lessons, one in Canberra and one in Zurich. And you definitely asked more questions. You were asking questions, but also I found it incredibly inspiring, the way you would describe things, the way you would suggest things. And I was left with something. It wasn't about the minor things. It was about the big questions of what's going on. And it served me very well, even just in terms of, I just think of an excerpt like Pictures, the beginning of Pictures, and the way we talked about where the energy points were, where it was going and what it was, and just beyond the idea of just obviously with a great sound and great articulation in tune. But that served me incredibly well. And I can imagine that people that get to study with you for a whole degree, plus that creation, I think we can call it culture, that class culture. And it was definitely and it's still in Canberra. When I think those guys that are 3 of them that have been in the Sydney Symphony together now they've been there for 20 years or more since then, really. Yep. Almost. And
absolutely.
And I think of Tom, and I don't know your students in Northwestern, but I can imagine that they study with you and then they go and teach, and that creates that's how tradition is created, I think.
Very much, yeah. Teaching has been an incredible blessing for me. There are times when the organization and bureaucracy of it get me down a little bit, because it's a lot to manage. But the actual content of it, the process of it, and then the flowering of, the manifestation of where people go and how they go. And there's so many examples when I listen to exes of mine doing this around the world, and and I listen to them playing, then I listen to the results of their teaching, and the fact that they believe very strongly in these ideals. And I've had very good feedback from major orchestras where some of these people are. For example, I've heard from music directors like Michael Tilson Thomas and Simon Rattle, and people who are very esteemed in our classical music world, and the fact that they respect the same ideals that we've espoused in our trombone culture. And so I remember Dale said to me once that it isn't so much the concerts that you starred in, it's not the records that you made that sold well, it's not how famous you are. The only thing that might have any kind of longevity in terms of your imprint on the world are your students. And that is something that just keeps going and going and going. And if you think back to great teachers, if you think, for example, Leopold Auer in the violin world, and or any of the gurus on the violin is a very good example where a master teacher has begotten so many disciples, and somehow that school keeps living on. And so it was never my conscious goal to do that, but it's ended up happening by virtue of the principles in which I believe.
Absolutely. Yeah, unquestionably. I want to now go, there's something that I've noticed from afar, just from seeing comments. I wanted you to talk a bit about the summer festival that you've done for many years. Is it Grand Teton? Is that the name?
Yes.
I'd like to hear more about that.
It was a great blessing to me. When I joined the Chicago Symphony, it was culturally a little bit like going to work in a coal mine. It was very much a old, grumpy white guy culture. A lot of very disciplined pros who were all very tough, and they didn't care to make things nice just because making nice is nice. They were professional. There's no BS, and the relationships were not very nurturing, if you like. And it wasn't a sense that I felt I wanted to be nurtured. I just felt it was more hardcore than it needed to be. And I felt that it came at a price that there could have been better collaboration, there could have been better cooperation. And frankly, I think there could have been better results ultimately if people had been willing to be better communicators, and if they were more interested in a dialogue instead of always the monologue. So that was my first impression in the orchestra there for my first few years. I heard all these people doing their own thing, and because it had been a tradition, there was quite a bit of alignment in what they were doing, but there could have been a lot more nuance and a lot more give and take than there was. That evolved as the orchestra rejuvenated, but this is now, we're talking, I moved to Chicago in 1990, very beginning of 1990. So those first several years were not easy for me philosophically. I loved the level, I loved the intensity. I just felt on a human level, it didn't need to be that, raw. And this may have to do with the fact that American orchestras have had to fight very, very hard for their quality of life. as they organized themselves into union orchestras with collective bargaining agreements, those things, those working conditions were hard fought, hard to win. Our first organizing committee had all the members fired from the orchestra. They were eventually reinstated, but it was rough. So these guys were used to tough times, and many of the people playing in the orchestra were refugees from the war, and they'd seen incredibly tough times. So naturally, their lives had been very, very hard. And so while they're very, very grateful to be in America, you can understand that their life hadn't exactly been what I call flowers and puppies. So in any case, I mention that because I had the opportunity to get an opportunity to play at the Grand Teton Music Festival, because I was recommended as a trombone player to an early music group in Chicago called Music of the Baroque. And this was a very fine group, still in existence, very high level group. And the brass scene there was very much led by Barbara Butler and Charlie Geyer.
Very famous teachers. Very famous.
Yes, very famous, very successful teachers. They were at Eastman at the time that I met them, but they came to Chicago to play Music of the Baroque. And so I got to play with them, and we hit it off straight away. And they, almost straight away said, "We're looking for a new first trombone at the Teton Music Festival. Do you want to come?" And so that was my in right there. It was just, it's just the dumb luck of who you know. And you can't apply for a job like that. It's all connections. And so I've been there for 30 years. And I mention that because it was a great foil to the Chicago Symphony. Everyone who played at the Teton Music Festival chose to be there because they loved this place. They love these people. Everything about it is beautiful. The playing is of a very high level. The hall is beautiful. It's in one of the most beautiful parts of the world, one of the most very beautiful parts of America. And so there's just the joy of making music and the joy of being with each other. And it was the antithesis in character, in personality to my day job back at the Chicago Symphony. So that nurtured me. And over time, the Chicago Symphony rejuvenated and evolved and became a group of not just great players, but many, many great people. And I have a couple of very, very close friends in the orchestra that my favorite people in the world. And so I'm glad I stuck around in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. At one point, relatively early on, I was reconsidering my options, and I still had the opportunity to return to Australia and teach in Canberra. And I was kind of my last chance to do that. And I remember having a long conversation with Barenboim on tour in Japan. And he was also going through doubts. And he convinced me to stay. We didn't say this explicitly, but it was like, if you stay, I stay. I stay, you stay, kind of thing. And it worked out like that. And we always had a good kinship. He was a wonderful person to explore music with. He was someone you could discuss anything with him, and you could disagree with him on anything. I have stories of things that he would do that we would discuss and we disagree on, and he would do stuff. He was so he was just so spontaneous, but he convinced me. It's his. Okay, two facts. It's Charlie Vernon's fault that I'm in the Chicago Symphony, and it's Barenboim's fault that I stayed, and it's Gene Pokorny's fault that I'm still there. So that means three facts. Firstly, when they were replacing Frank Crisafulli, Charlie Vernon actually wrote me a letter on the 8th of August, 1988, 8888. And he wrote me this not short letter about how important this job was and how difficult it was going to be to win and everything that a player had to do to be successful. And that letter made me take that audition much more seriously, because I wasn't really considering it even as a realistic possibility. So it was kind of his fault that I auditioned. And then Barenboim, when I was having my doubts, Barenboim convinced me to stay, as I described to you. And then over the years, I've had the incredible support of this amazing musician, Gene Pokorny, who brings so much to his job, so much care, preparation, flexibility, sensitivity. And he has been a great musical ally of mine. He's been someone who's been all about the team, all about being collaborative and building things and standing for the right stuff and speaking up when people needed to speak up. And I couldn't last in an orchestra. One can't last in an orchestra on this level without support. And so those three people are, and of course others. I mean, many people have been very, very generous to me. Jay, my longtime colleague, legend, Jay Friedman, has been incredibly generous and thoughtful person, and too many people to mention. But the Tetons is just like, it's like they say it's like a youth orchestra for older people. It's got the vibe, got the enthusiasm. Everyone's thrilled to see each other. Everyone's hugging and partying, and after every concert you go out celebrating, and you go on hikes together and cook together, and it's just a great scene.
Wonderful.
It's like a summer holiday, and the level's very high. Donald Runnicles is the music director there for about 10 years, and he does a beautiful job. And a lot of great soloists want to go there now because it's got such a reputation for a high level and also a great experience as well.
Wonderful. Now, you mentioned Gene, obviously one of the legendary tuba players of our times, and you've mentioned about fantastic friendships. So that segues beautifully into my last topic that I wanted to talk to you about. Not a topic, it's a very, very dear friend of both of ours. He's already been gone now for 20 years. That's amazing for me to think about that it's been 20 years since we lost Frank. But I do want to take this time to talk about Frank Barzak, who I was lucky enough to get to know in the last few years of his life, and who you knew him. You probably knew him since he was a lad, I guess. So I really want to spend some time talking about Frank.
Well, a very, very special person. I can't recall our first encounter, but I do remember what an exceptional human being he was. When you would talk to Frank, he would absorb you with every pore in his body. He would hang on your every syllable, and you could just see him. You could see him synthesize all of these experiences, and you could see him almost growing during the sentence. He was getting it, and he was getting it, and he was getting it, and he was the most virtuoso sponge. He had incredible intellect. He had incredible sensitivity, incredible kindness, incredible humor, and he was also, in the most charming way, quite peculiar. He was so very, very unique. I remember he came out to the Tetons and we hiked together, and he got terrible. His boots didn't work, and he got the most dreadful blisters, and he was we were on this long trek, and he's got these Teva shoes that like glorified thongs, but it just didn't bother him. He just would not, he could not find a way to let go of the joy of life and the joy of discovery and the joy of adventure. And this childlike enthusiasm and euphoria at the experience allowed him to become such a sophisticated and thoughtful musician. And it was a great sadness for me that, later I could understand the context better, but he did audition for my orchestra in Cologne, and it was a high-level audition, and there was a very stark contrast between the two leading candidates for the job, and Frank was one of them, and the other, Hans Nickel, who was a virtuoso tuba player from Holland, a marvelous, beautiful tuba player. And it became very clear that, as in German auditions, at the audition, the orchestra was kind of split. It was basically split largely between brass players and the rest of the orchestra, and maybe more accurately between the brass players and the string players. And it was clear that both of them were qualified to have the job, but the brass players definitely wanted Hans. There was definitely a certain density and vigor and I'm trying to think of the right word, power in his playing. And there were other qualities that Frank had in terms of musicality and nuance and control and finesse and these kinds of things. And so of course I looked like I'm biased because Frank grew up in Australia. So naturally, colleagues who think like this think, well, of course he's going for the Australian. Who could blame him? He's Australian. So one thing I struggled with in Germany was a little bit of the sense that if I think something, well, it's because of where I'm from. It's not necessarily because this is my deduction or my conclusion, or this is what my rationality leads me to. It's more that, well, that's his leaning, that's his kind of bias. And so I hope that the fact that Frank was Australian didn't actually harm him. And then it was a very close thing. I mean, it was a razor thin thing. And as you know, it's a democratic thing. And I know that it was a very tough day for Frank. It was a very, very tough day for me. But Frank hung in there, and he only got better and better and better. And he never allowed himself to be the victim of disappointments, even though he ended up going through some incredibly difficult things toward the end of his way too short life. Given his heritage with his Viennese mother, you know, I think he would love to have had a sincere crack at the Vienna Phil, but he ended up in a beautiful place in Zurich, and you know, he has been one of the great blessings in my life, and he is on my locker. When I open my locker at Orchestra Hall, that's who I look at. And he's on my studio at Northwestern too. And good that you mentioned this, because I'm staying in a hotel room here in quarantine in Sydney in Darling Harbour, and full circle, Scott Kinmont, one of my great exes, great teacher, great player in the Sydney Symphony. There's his trombone there. And right here, right underneath my little iPad, this is fantastic. As Jay Friedman was saying, it's fantastic. And here is a book of bassoon studies by Weissenborn. And right there.
I know that stamp. I remember that stamp.
Right there. So the fact that you brought him up, and the fact that I happen to be borrowing these studies from Scott Kinmont, see, how can you not believe in fate?
That's a
right
nice. That's
I'm
nice.
making my way this week.
Speaking very selfishly for myself, I'm glad that Frank didn't get the job in Köln, because that led to everything that led to him being in Zurich for the last couple of years of his life and living with me for a while. And I'd known him in Australia just as when I was coming up. Frank was he was younger than you and Hector, but when he played the Lovelock with the Sydney Symphony in the concerto competition, he had these long tails, this long tail jacket. Frank was another legendary figure. And when eventually it turned out that he came to Zurich and he was trying to get the job in the opera house in Zurich, and he lived with me for a while, there were some of the really very, very special times in my life. And I would play for him. I would play my excerpts for him, and he would come and hear the orchestra a lot. And I had one of those Übkabine. Have you ever seen an Übkabine? Do you know what that is?
I do.
I had an Übkabine. And so when Frank would play the Übkabine with his tuba, the everything would shake, the camera would shake, and the resonance of this man. And I'll never forget. Just, it would have been only less than a week before he left us. He played a magnificent Bruckner 6 with the Opera House Orchestra. They played Bruckner 6 in the Tonhalle. And
yep.
I think that we know a lot of people in common, but I think Frank is someone who is just anybody. And I think anybody who knew Frank, and it was so clear, the people in the Zurich Opera that only knew him for a year, this was someone who touched them deeply. And he was so I think that this series of interviews I'm doing, if it serves no other purpose than for a generation of people that don't know Frank to hear about Frank and to hear just this incredible love that we feel for him, I think that will be a great purpose. So,
and let me interrupt you before you wind up here, Geoff, because I'm not on any kind of time limit here. I've got another 4 days.
So let's not wind up. Let's keep going. No hurry.
No, I want to add to that, because as you're describing that, and as you're describing how Frank was, just now, I now have a way of describing his impact on people, and his impact on me, and his impact on Gabby, and Hector, and yourself. He had the impact of an angel. He kind of descended into your life, and he kind of got under your wings,
lifted you up,
and everything. Absolutely. He was like this very gentle and incredibly powerful force, always seeking, ever curious, always joyful, always stimulated, and always amused, and always enchanted. When we lost him, a devastating reality. It happened at a time, it was winter, and it was a very busy time in Chicago, and Gabby had gone over earlier than I, and I could not see a way that I could go to his funeral. And a very good friend of mine said, there doesn't have to be a way, you just have to go. And so I suddenly got, thank God I had this fine friend who gave me a proper context. And I went, and I flew to Frankfurt, and I had a connecting flight to Zurich, and my plane was the last plane to land before they closed the airport because it was snowing, and they couldn't land planes anymore. I arrived on the morning of the funeral. I got to the church not even an hour before the service. In other words, it was literally like crossing the Red Sea that I could even make it, and somehow I did. And it would have been a tragedy were I not be able to go. It was also the only time that's ever happened in my life, and I don't ever expect it again, that Gabby would ever speak in public. That's her least favorite thing to do, and she was determined that she would, and she did. And that says a lot, that someone who is so reticent to be publicly heard was so compelled to speak important words about Frank on that particular occasion. But yes, now he had the energy and the impact of an angel, no doubt about it. Yeah. Well, kind of remarkable. I think of all the personalities, all of your teachers growing up, all of my teachers, when my dad was trying to teach me, and I was too much of a smart ass, and he, you know, I already knew everything, and so it was ridiculous. So he found, you know, one of the people that he knew as a young man who was in the Sydney Symphony, Baden McCarron, very successful, very old school, very conservative, hard-nosed, but very, very kind teacher. I think of a personality like him, who was a kind, old school gentleman who looked after us, taught us lessons for $4 a lesson. And my parents never drove, so Baden would often drive me home. Sometimes getting to his place in East Killara, or whatever it was called, East Linfield, was difficult on public transport. And there were times when it was just easier for me to walk. So I would go from North Ryder, walk across down to Lane Cove Road, go across the Lane Cove River Bridge there and up through the park and all the way up there. I mean, sometimes in summer, this little kid with a trombone, I don't know how many miles that is. It has to be like, I don't know,
5 miles or something. Yeah,
maybe 5 miles. And
Yeah.
then I'd have my lesson, and then then he'd teach all the kids, and I would hang around and listen to the other lessons and wait for him. And then he would cook himself a steak, and then we'd go in his combi van. He'd drop me at home, and then he'd go into the Opera House and do a concert, and he would drive me home. Just, you know, these little kindnesses like that. And then, you know, I got to play in the Willoughby Band, and Peter Walmsley was very good to me. And then Cliff Goodchild, who mentored so many brass players, very, very kind to me.
Me included.
You know?
Cliff was
exactly
a huge mentor for me. Cliff and Paul, inestimable.
Yeah. You know, Cliff found this new trombone concerto written by the British composer Buxton Orr that had been commissioned for Dennis Wick. And very soon after Dennis Wick premiered it, I got to do the Australian premiere at the Opera House with Cliff and the Waverley Band. And that was in my last year of high school. I mean, who gets to do that? You know, those kinds of opportunities.
I can tell you, Cliff, I'd been playing the trumpet for 3 months. And Cliff, I was playing third cornet in the Waverley Band, and Cliff said, right, now you're going to start playing solo cornet. And I couldn't play. I was not ready for that. But I was learning from Paul at that time. And Cliff said, okay, now it's time for you to start playing solo cornet. He said, and Cliff, the drive and it just became a fact. Amazing. Yeah.
There are a lot of people.
I'm glad we're talking about Cliff as well. That's another huge influence.
A lot of people. So many people have a hand in it. You know, when I went to the Conservatorium High School, I had to study the trombone there, so I had to leave Baden, and I had this very awkward and painful conversation. I don't even remember how or what I said, but I said I'm going to the Conservatorium, and I could tell that was very difficult for him to hear because I was definitely his boy, and I will always be his student. But then I started taking from Geoff Bailey, who was a completely different kind of teacher and also very generous and gave me great opportunities and opened up all kinds of new horizons for me on the trombone. But, you know, when you start to list them, then I go back even earlier when I got into the school band at Holy Cross, Brother Mark Ryan, who just passed away just very, very recently, who started so many people on brass instruments. And he was still, I mean, the last Anzac Day, he didn't make this last one. He died just before this last Anzac Day. But Anzac Day last year, he got out in front of the college there and at dawn playing the last post for Anzac Day. And he played with the Leichhardt Band and started bands everywhere. And, you know, all these great mentors and teachers. And I mean, music was just his hobby. He wasn't a music teacher. He was a fantastic chemistry teacher, I think was his main. Holy Cross was very good for maths and science and rugby. They're very good at maths and science. I was not very good at maths and science. I was better at rugby, but yeah. There are no videos. There are no videos of playing rugby. Although in Canberra, as a young kid, our team, I think it was the 5 Stone Sevens, went down and we played in a round robin competition in Canberra. And in our game down there, I scored 3 tries. I have never scored a try in any other game in my life. And in Canberra, I had a glorious day. I scored 3 tries. I was the hero of the nation.
What position were you playing?
I was a second rower. I was a tough gritty. I wasn't very glamorous. I didn't gain the weight and the muscle to stay in a position like that. You know, once you get to be 14, 15, you know, those kids really, really fill out. I never did. But yeah, so it was nice that I went back to Canberra, because that was, you know, I did have one glory day there as a boy. I almost didn't want to have a bath when I got home, because I wanted to keep the mud on me from my triumph of the battle.
I know exactly what you mean, because I remember once I was rugby league. My brother was a proper halfback, but I was terrible at rugby league. And there was just one day where just during lunchtime, I had some game and my shirt was out and I was walking home and I really felt like I was somebody, had a bit of mud on my shirt. I know exactly what you mean. I didn't score 3 tries, but I know that feeling there's a real feeling of accomplishment. I would have been, in grade 3 or grade 4, shirt hanging out. I know what you mean.
That's your battle trophy.
That's funny. Mike, I'm going to say goodbye to our audience, but I'm not going to say goodbye to you. But just okay. When I'm going to end the interview, but I want to just say thank you so much. I think that a lot of the people that we've talked about are going to enjoy watching this, but I think a much wider audience will be really grateful to hear your insights. And I think the theme to me is it's just the big picture feeling. And also what I've got a sense of, just understanding your gratitude to everyone who helped you along the way. It's like all of the stories you've told, it's always been about how your students have supported you, how your colleagues have supported you, the conductors. And I think that will be a big take home message for me. So I'm going to say bye to our lovely audience.
My pleasure. My pleasure speaking with everyone.